Well, good morning. We're going to do a little exercise this morning, okay? You need to hold your hands like this. And you need to take a big, deep breath in. You go, and hold it. And let it out. All right, we all ready? We're going to talk about money today. It's out there, all right? You know, I think it's really important to talk about money. And let me just get this across first. Giving to God is not about the money itself. And be honest, God doesn't need your money. Now, with that said, we're going to dive deeper into that, but I want you just to relax and sit back because we're going to talk about money because, let's be honest, money has become somewhat of an issue. But it's an important part of being a Christian and the walk in a Christian life. One of the things is I love being a Southern Baptist. So often we hear in the news, especially over this past week, about the negative sides of what it means to be a Southern Baptist. But the fact of the matter is that so often one of the greatest things about being a Southern Baptist is lost. It wasn't until I went to seminary did I even have a clue what the Cooperative Program was. That little video was just a snapshot into what it means to be a Southern Baptist and what it means to put $1 in a plate of a Southern Baptist church. It means that together, we work together, not just in this state, but also across all the states, to work together for the purpose of bringing the kingdom about. So let me show you what that looks like a little bit. I have a little graphic up here to show you. So it's actually came out a little bit harder to see than I wanted it to, but for every dollar that gets sent on from this church, it goes to what's called the Cooperative Program. So when you put $1 in the plate of this church, what happens is that it goes to things like keeping the lights on. It goes to paying staff. It goes to the necessary things that we do in ministry. It goes to things that are outreach events and things like that. But also a portion of what we collect goes on to goes through what's called the Cooperative Program. We are a part of a state convention which keeps 45 cents and takes that 55 cents and passes it along. So a quick snapshot, and you can find more information about this. There's a website if you want to write it down. It's called whatiscp.com. And it'll explain everything. But basically in a snapshot, what it says is that for every dollar that this church passes on to the state convention, of that, 28 cents will go directly towards funding international missionaries. Isn't that amazing to think about? That because of what you just gave, there is a missionary somewhere in some scary place where they're not allowed to legally say the name of Jesus Christ, and they are planting churches and sharing the gospel on your behalf. Good for you. You did that. Not only that, but across North America, going to some places that are really difficult, places like California, Massachusetts, Canada itself, where you now have what are called home missionaries or North American missionaries who are actively planting churches and reaching people for the gospel. In the state itself, we have people who are planting churches across the state. They are revitalizing churches. Churches that were thinking about having to shut the door. Instead, they're opening and vibrant as because of money that you put in a plate today. You did that. Here's the thing. God is calling us to work together. Today we're going to be looking at 2 Corinthians, chapter 9. And it's really important here because one of the things that we've been told about in our world and in our culture is about self-sufficiency. You know, I purposely did not watch the Grammys this year, and from all accounts, I was pretty excited that I didn't. But the world is talking about money. There is a female rap artist, and when I tell you her name is Cardi B, and she performed the song last Sunday night for the nation to watch. And some of you are familiar with her, some of you are not. And I do not endorse her music. Let me be very clear. In fact, I would tell you to stay far, far away from it. But the words that she basically said in her song that the whole nation heard last week, for those who tuned in, was this, and I'll try to read this here. But nothing is in this world I like more than checks. And then in parentheses it says money. I've never heard the song, so I couldn't tell you exactly what that means. All I really want to see is the money. The fact of the matter is the world is talking about money. The world is talking about money. The world is talking about this need and this desire we have for stuff. And the fact of the matter is that that is nothing that is new. In fact, it has been around forever. We're about to read a letter that Paul is writing to a church in Corinth. It is over 2,000 years. During this time, Paul is writing, and he is writing, and the words you're about to read are in stark contrast to one of the popular philosophers of the day. Paul was a contemporary of a Stoic philosopher named Seneca. And Seneca basically taught that proud independence of self-sufficiency creates true happiness. Let me say it again in this way. Happiness comes from independence and self-sufficiency. Does that sound familiar to anyone? It should. It sounds like the American dream. If you just work hard enough, if you just do everything you need, if you just put your nose to the grindstone, whatever thing you want to say, but when it comes out of it, right, if you just work hard enough, you can get what you need, you can be self-sufficient, and you will find happiness in that self-sufficiency. You will find happiness in working for that. People crave stuff. And that is the problem with us, is that we crave stuff. And it's not a bad thing to have stuff. Don't get me wrong. But where the problem happens is when the stuff becomes more important than God. It's not by accident that one of the 10 commandments that God left behind for the Israelites to read was, "Thou shalt not covet." Because he knew that in our hearts and in our desires that we are going to crave stuff. And we want stuff. The other day I was walking through Sam's Club. And when you walk into Sam's Club, there's this whole display of TVs. I mean, they have TVs that you could like stack 3 of me and put me inside it, right? I mean, it's just great, right? All these vibrant colors and everything. And it's amazing, right? And this time of year is especially hard because the new models of TVs are coming out. So that means the old models are now on sale and they're trying to move them. And I sit there and I say, wow, I can almost afford that. And then you turn the corner and you go, wow, I can actually afford that. You know, it's amazing to me to think about in my own life. I've been wanting a new TV for a very long time. The fact is that there's nothing wrong with my old TV. It's actually a perfectly good TV. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a Samsung. It's a smart TV. It does everything I need it to do. We live in a culture of excess. We are told and we are taught that we need more and we need to get more because stuff. It's how it's marketed to us. The fact of the matter is that I have plenty of TVs for my house. I do not need another TV for my house. But I find myself desiring it and wanting it when there's nothing wrong with it. How often do we as people take perfectly good cars and basically say, you know what, it's ready for a new one, so I'll just put it aside and get a new one? It happens. When it comes down to it, we oftentimes let stuff get in the way. Why do we do that? You see, Paul is writing this letter to the church in Corinth. And the church of Corinth, they had issues, to put it mildly. For those of you who are not familiar with the church in Corinth was planted by Paul, and it had trouble. It had trouble where, think about last week, we observed the Lord's Supper. Can you imagine what it would be like if half the congregation was drunk while observing the Lord's Supper? Welcome to Corinth. Can you imagine what it would be like if a prominent leader in the church was having an illicit affair with his mother-in-law? Welcome to Corinth. Corinth in and of itself is just nothing but a church with issues. And many of you have been in a church that has struggled and just had a spirit where it was just heavy, and it seemed like nothing seemed to work. The theology was just kind of off, and it was just messy. I'm glad I didn't get an amen on that one. You see, here's the thing, is that this church in Corinth had issues. Paul, in and of itself, he would go and he would plant a church, and then he would go off, and he would sometimes go back and visit, but rarely sometimes would he actually go back and visit these places. But he would continue to go on and plant churches. He actually made it a point to go back and revisit the church in Corinth because he was trying to basically correct the issues. The first letter, Paul plants the church, and then he addresses all these issues. And then he realizes the issues are so troublesome. He goes back again and tries to help correct and reestablish, to which there is a letter that was written back to Paul that we don't have. It's not part of Scripture. And then we have Paul reassuring his love and care for this church in Corinth and how he's not turning their back on them. And he's talking about the supremacy of Christ and how Christ is supposed to reign in their hearts and the true signs of what it means to be a follower of Christ for the first 7 chapters of this letter. But see, during this time when Paul writes this letter, there's something big going on in the history of the world. Jerusalem, in and of itself, is under a terrible, terrible famine. And not only are they under a terrible famine, but I mean, like, people are, like, dying, right? There's no Red Cross that's bringing in water and food, right? People are dying. And so as a result, the Christians in the church in Jerusalem are struggling just to meet the bare necessities of life. And so Paul organizes all these churches around the area, all these churches, and say, hey, can you take up donations? Can you bring donations? And these churches are giving. In fact, we taught in chapter 8 here, there's this church in Macedonia who cannot wait to give, and they are so excited to give. And they are just exuberant in wanting to help these people who are in such desperate need. But then Paul turns and addresses Corinth because they didn't take up such an offering. Because the problem was an issue of the heart. Fact is that God didn't need the money of Corinth to provide for the people of Jerusalem. Paul was pointing to this as an issue of their heart, and their heart still wasn't completely in line with Jesus's. It was a sign of deficiency of their faith. How many of us have a sign of deficiency in our faith? How many of us are deficient in our faith? Because, let's look into it, this is what Paul is talking about and how important giving is to our faith. Because God doesn't need your money. But rather, God has given you the ability to give as a gift from Him to you. Let me show you what that means. Follow along with me as I start in verse 6 of 2 Corinthians chapter 9. This is the point. Whoever sows sparingly will reap sparingly. And whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctant or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things, that at all time may abound in every good work, as it is written, He has distributed freely, and He has given to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way, to be generous in every way, which is through us will produce thanksgiving to God. For the ministry of the service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, but also overflowing in many thanksgivings to God. By their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission, flowing from your confession of the gospel of Christ, of the generosity of your contribution for them and all others, while they were along for you and pray for you because of all surpassing grace upon you. Thanks be to God for this inexpressible gift. Here's the thing about giving. Giving is important because it is a heart condition. It is not that God needs anything from you. In fact, the gospel is the complete opposite. God doesn't need man to do anything. It is completely the work of Jesus Christ. It is completely the work of God sending his Son into this world. And by the fact that he sent his Son into this world, that Jesus Christ then took your sin upon himself, thus freeing you from sin, thus taking that debt that you could not pay upon himself so that you could be returned to a right relationship with him. What a beautiful, beautiful picture. But you know what's absent from that? Anything you can do. There's nothing that you can do to save yourselves. I can't give extra money to the church. I can't do extra work. I can't go create a nonprofit to feed poor homeless children in Africa. It's all going to fail short. None of that will save you. The only thing that will save you is the fact that Jesus took his nail-pierced arms and stretched them out on the cross and died, taking your sin upon yourself. And because he has done that for you, you've been given a gift. And all you have to do is open it. It's just that simple. All you have to do is be willing to receive that gift. But here's the thing. We've been talking about spiritual disciplines. We've been talking about walking with Christ. We've been talking about what it means to be a follower of him. And what that means is understanding and recognizing your place in this world. And your place in this world is second to Christ. So often we worry about self-sufficiency. So often we worry about making sure that we can provide for ourselves, that we lose sight of the fact that the Father in heaven who created us, who sent his Son to die on the cross for you, loves you so much that he's not going to just stop because your basic needs aren't met. But rather, he's going to continue to provide for those. So, if you look at what Paul's talking about, this heart of being a cheerful giver, everything rallies around verse 6. What verse 6 says is to this point, whoever sows sparingly will reap sparingly, and also whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. It's a general farming agrarian term that society would have been very familiar with. For us, we're removed from it a little bit, but I think you get the gist of it, right? If I had a garden in my backyard and I decided I wanted to grow, I don't know, pick something. Wheat? We'll pick wheat. If I wanted to grow wheat, I need to put wheat seed down. And if I'm going to grow this wheat, the idea is that I'm going to put more than just a couple seeds down. Rather, I'm going to put a lot down. The more seeds I put down, the more wheat plants will grow, and the more they'll grow, the more wheat I'll get back. It's not mind-blowing, but that's a basic concept here. You see, this whole idea of sowing seed, what Paul is getting across is, do you trust God? There's an old story about a king who was going through his kingdom, and he came across a beggar. And all these beggars were coming up to him and asking for money from the king, hoping that the king would give something great and precious to them, hoping that would be something that would provide for their needs. And this one beggar comes up to the king and asks for alms, and the king looked at him and said, "What will you give me?" This beggar was shocked, and he didn't have much, but he reached into his pocket. He pulled out 3 grains of rice and gave them to the king. Unbeknownst to him, while he did this, the king pulled out 3 gold coins and put it in his bowl. And this beggar was left distraught because he was saying to himself, "I wish I wouldn't have held anything back. I wish I would have trusted the king to give me more." You see, how often do we approach God in the same way? How often do we approach him and say to ourselves, "I'll give you just a little bit because I've got to deal with all this other stuff"? You see, it's a heart condition because am I willing to trust him with everything in my life? Am I willing to trust him with the hard and difficult things in my life? And the reason why we do this, and the reasons why we ask, and the reasons how we give and why we give are very simple, and Paul lays them out here. God doesn't want you to give out of guilt or obligation. Verse 7. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion. Think about that. God is the God of the universe. He could require an exact amount that you're supposed to give. He could require everything. And he could guilt you and be like, "Hey, Mike, I did die for you, so cough up a couple extra bucks here." That's not how God approaches us. What God approaches us and how he approaches us is saying, "Will you trust me with your stuff? Will you trust me? Because if you will trust me, I will bless you." It's a faith issue. It's a heart issue. It's a trust issue. But how often do we trust God? I'll never forget, I was pastoring a church in a very agrarian society. There were a bunch of cotton farmers. I remember sitting around a lunch table. They would call it dinner, or they call it dinner out there, but it was lunch for us. And as I was sitting around and they were talking, the wife I was sitting there talking to, she was like, "Well, you know about farmers, right? We're farmers. We're the biggest gamblers that are out there. Because we will put all this money into our fields and pray to God and ask to give us a return." And you know what I was thinking when she said that? Keyword is thinking, because I didn't share any of this out loud, because I would have gotten a look and probably was asked to leave the house. I started thinking about, you trust God and you gamble and give that all to God and you pray and ask him to do that, but I'm pretty sure you have crop insurance, just in case God doesn't come through. I'm pretty sure there's a farm bill that people are debating now that has all these different subsidies on it, so you can trust the federal government just in case God doesn't come through for you. Where is the true faith in that? Bounce that with another farmer. He would go and he would plow the land that his father had left him. He goes, "I don't know if I'm going to get anything out of it or not." He goes, "And I don't take insurance because I'm just going to trust that either God's going to provide or God's not going to provide." I met a lot of farmers, but none were more righteous than that man. You see, here's the thing. It comes down to this heart aspect. It comes down to this issue of, do you truly trust God? Are you willing to give him all these things? And God doesn't want to compel you. God doesn't want to force you. God doesn't want me to stand up here and tell you something ridiculous that you've probably heard on television or you've heard someone make fun of on television before, about how if you just give a little bit of seed money here, then God is going to multiply that. You see, the problem with that whole philosophy and that thinking and that theology and the way it's being taught is that we give more with the expectation that we're going to get more, and we're going to get more for us to consume. That is not what Paul is talking about here. That is not what the gospel is talking about. You see, what the gospel is talking about, what Paul is talking about, is that we give to God for our benefit, to be a part of his work. It's a heart issue that when we trust him, then he will supply every need. Because it's about righteousness. God does not want you to be guilted into giving, but rather it's about walking in righteousness. It's about walking with God in the right way. You ever notice how when you give, it gives you a good feeling? When you give someone, it just really makes an impact on yourself. Say, hey, look what I've done. You know why that is? Because it comes from God. Because that's what righteousness is. Even when we don't do it in the right way, we still can experience some of the power of God. So I'm imploring you today is to give in the right way. And when you give in the right way, what it comes down to is walking with God in righteousness. Because what God is going to do is he is going to enrich you. Verse 10, he who supplies the seed to the sower will bring bread and food, will supply and multiply your seed for sowing, and increase the harvest among your righteousness. You see, what God is going to do is he's testing your faith. If you are willing to trust him, and you are willing to give, you've proven yourself worthy, and God's going to give you more. Now this isn't an exact principle because you're going to go through times in your life and trials, and God is going to use financial hardships to speak to you. But this is a basic principle that I want you to hear, is that for righteousness' sake, God is going to give things to you and put them in your hands. And that if you prove yourself to say, I can do this, then he is going to give you more. There is a parable of a man who goes away and he has servants and he gives them a whole bunch of talents. And when this master returns, each one of them, except for that last one who was only given one, was given double of what he had. He was entrusted with double for the master's work. You want to make a difference in this life? You want to make a difference in this world? Give him your checkbook. Give God your checkbook. Give him control of it. And he'll give you more. But that more that you get is not for you to consume. It's for you to extend his kingdom. So here's the thing. This is always the question when we talk about money. How much? You know, this week I did a lot of research, did a lot of reading in the Greek, and I could only find the word tithing in the New Testament, or any form of it, 10 times. And basically what tithing is, if you're not familiar, it's a church term. It comes from the Bible. It specifically comes from the Old Testament. It was how the Jewish culture was set up, that a person was supposed to, when they would have a harvest, they would give a tenth of what they gathered, and it would be used to keep up what was another tribe of Israel. There were 12 tribes in Israel. One of those tribes was the Levites. The Levites were in charge of all the priestly and ministry things. They didn't have land. They weren't given any land. Instead, it was the other 11 tribes' responsibility to give a tenth of everything they made, and they would support the other tribe. So the other tribe could be consumed with being in the ministry of God. It's this beautiful thing. I find it fascinating that it's nowhere in the New Testament. And I came to a realization this week. I think there's a reason why that is. And that reason comes out of Acts chapter 4. We're going to go here and then we're going to finish. Acts chapter 4, verse 32. This is describing the first church and Christians and how they worked and how they lived together. There are some that had a lot. There were some that were destitute and poor. The common bond that they had was Jesus Christ. So listen to these words. Now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own, but they had everything in common. If you're following along, skip down to 34. And there was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of land or houses sold them, and brought all the proceeds of what that was sold, and they laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each who had need. What a beautiful story. You see, there was no one who was in need. Can you imagine if we were a church in which no one was in need? Can you imagine what a church would look like and what that ministry would be to people, where people would come here and say, I'm in need, and we were able to address and meet all those needs? Let me tell you this. It's possible. But it's up to you. You see, you had people like Barnabas in the early church in Acts. You know him as a traveling companion of Paul. But Barnabas comes forward, and he's a wealthy landowner. And he sells his land, and he doesn't hold back. He doesn't just give a tenth of it. He gives all of it, so that widows and orphans could be fed and taken care of. Here's the thing. I don't want to compel you to give. I don't want to make it seem like I'm trying to trick you or anything. But you're supposed to give to God. And so the question you might have is, okay, well, how much? And my theological answer is, I don't know. And the reason why that is that it is between you and God. It has nothing to do with me. It has nothing to do with this church. It has everything to do with you and God. Because he wants someone with a cheerful heart. He wants someone with this be compelled by his grace and desire for righteousness. So with that said, let's talk some basics, right? A tithe or a tenth is doable. It's a great place to start. If you're not someone who's giving, if you're not someone who is quote-unquote tithing, 10% is a great place to start. What does that look like? Look at it in this way. How many of you, if you were going to back in school and you were going to take a test, you got a 90, how many of you would be pretty excited? Yeah, I would be, especially if you saw my report card. Especially in Hebrew. Let me tell you, if I was walking out with a 90, I'd be super excited. The fact of the matter is 90 is enough. A 90 is an A minus. That's great. It's important for us to realize this, though. That's a good place to start. But what if God is asking you to give more? I don't want you to be held back because you think of this arbitrary number that we get out of the Old Testament. Don't get me wrong, that is a great place to start if you're not tithing. And if you are not giving, if you are not tithing, if you're not willing to, well, honestly, take a leap in faith. But if you're sitting there, you're going, my heart is heavy and I don't know if I can, take a baby step. Sometimes you got to learn to walk before you can run. And sometimes you got to learn to crawl before you walk. But this, above all else, is what I want you to hear leaving here. If you're looking for a number to give, 10% is a great place to start because we have ample evidence in the Old Testament that that is a good number. However, I don't want to compel you to give. I want you to seek righteousness and turn your heart over to God. And I want you to see the blessings flow in your life when you start living for Him. When you start using your stuff for His purpose rather than your consumption. It takes faith. And it's scary. Now, here are things I don't want you to do. Do not go out and cancel insurance policies. They are good things to have, all right? I don't want you to misunderstand or misinterpret stuff. What I want you to do is I want you to get alone with God this week. And I want you to pray and offer Him your checkbook. I want you to pray and offer Him and ask Him for a number. And you know what? He'll supply it. He'll give it to you. Because the point being is this, is that because it's a heart issue, and what is the issue with our heart? If you go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, it's all about us wanting to be like God. That's why Eve takes the apple. That's what Satan tempts her with. It's trying to be like God. And when we take our stuff and we think that our stuff is more important than God, it becomes a problem. Can you trust God with your stuff? Can you start using your stuff for His glory rather than ours? I don't want you to feel compelled to give. I want you to seek righteousness and listen to God. Because one of the things that will happen is you'll find joy in your life when you are able to give. But Mike, I'm in debt, I have all these issues, this, that, and the other thing. I'll tell you what, financial peace will be offered soon. It's a great, long, 9-week process in which you will learn about how to get out of debt. And one of the fun things is about when you start getting out of debt is you realize that you are wasting all this money. And then you can take that and turn it around and start using that to bless others. It'll change your life. It starts with a baby step of just giving control to God, which is ultimately why we give the church. Why we give is because we're giving control to God so that we might be able to seek His righteousness first. If you realize that you have been not allowing that control of God in your life, but rather you've been seeking control, and maybe you need to come and pray with me, maybe you need to come and pray at the altar, maybe something I've said, you realize that you've been trying to control your life and you just need to turn it over to Jesus. I want to encourage you to come down here and pray with me, and let me show you those first steps that you can take to follow Him. It's a spiritual discipline. Are you willing to trust God and walk with Him?